Welcome everybody. In this video I'm going to continue the previous one where I talked about the 16-bit machines and those families. I have finished in July of 1985, so this is the point where I will continue. Until now the main focus was on the technology, but here I'll try to give you more insight about the economical part, the software part, as well as some legal. I finished the last video with an analogy, like those companies and those platforms were cars. I said they were ready to run the race, but to be honest, that was not 100% true. To be exact, each of them had their own problems. The Amiga was saved by Commodore, but it doesn't mean that everything was shiny. That time Commodore was bleeding money, so they had losses. They were one of the major companies because of the C64, but still they closed the first quarter of 85 with more than $20 million loss. To solve this issue, they hired Thomas Rettingen from Pepsi. At the beginning he was nominated as operational manager, but later on he became CEO. The IBM had also a failing idea. They had the PC Junior. PC Junior was their entry model, and to be honest, they implemented a lot of things there what I criticized previously. First of all, it had a sound chip, and also they developed the CGO further, and after that it was able to handle 16 colors in the resolution of 320 by 200. Atari was still in surviving mode, so they tried to sell their old 8-bit machines to provide enough money to keep the company afloat, because even if there was the ST, it was not 100% ready. Apple had a little bit different issues, and it was related to engineering. They fired Steve Jobs, who tried to take over the company. The departure of Steve Jobs indicated another issue, because a lot of engineers followed him to his new company. At the same time, the other founder, Steve Wozniak, also left the company. He criticized the management because how they handled Apple IIs. That time, the Apple IIs generated the revenue for Apple. It may sound strange because in this video I'm talking about the 16-bit families, but still, 3 of those companies produce most of their incomes from those 8-bit machines. But there was the other side at the same time. Intel released the 386. It was their first 32-bit CPU. The next year, 1986, was the year of development. In January, Apple released Macintosh II. It was a very good revision, because finally it included a SCSI controller, so it was easy to connect an external hard drive. They also changed the memory size. There were 4 SIM slots on the motherboard, so it was possible to expand the memory to 4 MB in an easy way. In the background, they worked on a new Macintosh model, but it was released just in 1987, so let's step forward. As I mentioned, Rettingen worked for Commodore, and in this year he was nominated as CEO. He started a full restructuring, and this restructuring was really painful. He had to cancel a lot of projects to reduce cost. He put Amiga in the focus of the developments. The Amiga OS was not really ready for production, but this year Amiga stepped forward and reached version 1.2, what we can consider as a stable version. They also developed few add-on cards for the machine. For example, there was the A1060, which made it possible to run IBM PC DOS on the computer. To be exact, not on the computer, because there was an 8088 CPU on the card, so it's somehow partially emulated, partially hardware emulated, an IBM PC compatible machine. Not just Commodore developed for this computer, but as well as external companies developed add-on cards. So it is possible to buy a third-party card with hard drive or a better 6820 CPU. Atari also had problem with the DOS stability. DOS means Tremel operating system or the operating system. As I know, the second one is the official, but the first one also a good moniker. But they managed to release a final version which was ready to put into ROM and include in their machines. They released the new variant of the Atari ST, and here let me talk about their numbering. It is a little bit strange because 512 kilobytes memory had the Atari ST 520. For 1 megabyte, they paired 1040. I heard a story they made it just to have a bigger number than the competitor. So when somebody said, oh, we have 1024 kilobytes of memory, they were able to say, yes, Atari ST 1040. Behind the ST, they put few letters. Those letters meant extra capability. For example, the F meant internal floppy drive. M meant internal modulator. So an Atari 10040 ST-FM is a machine with 1 megabyte of memory. It's an original ST, but floppy drive and an internal modulator. This machine was praised in the computer magazines because it had a very good price. It was possible to buy a complete system, so all together with monitor, mouse and whatsoever, for less than $1,000, and it was an exceptionally good offer. With this machine, Atari gained a very good reputation in Europe, and they sold a lot of them, especially in Germany, Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries. In the meantime, IBM worked on a new machine. To be exact, not just a new machine, but a new system. But as we know, the development cycle of the Big Blue took a lot of time, so they were not ready this year. They released one computer I would like to mention. It was the IBM PC Convertible, which was their first laptop. I have one and I have puzzled feelings. First of all, it is really solid. If there is a zombie attack, you can just use it as a weapon. In the other hand, I don't know, the LCD screen, it is just, I don't know what to say. It is very close to the worst I have ever seen. While IBM focused on development, they lost the leading position. Compaq released the Desk Pro 386. It is easy to guess what happened based on the name. Yes, it used a 386 CPU. IBM felt betrayed because Microsoft and Intel helped Compaq to develop this machine. But the most important fact, the platform with the clone makers started its own life. 1987 was an important year because a lot of new machines appeared on the market. Atari started to make IBM PC clones with the PC-1, but what was much more interesting, they also released their own laser printers. That way, they were able to provide a cheap alternative on the market of desktop publishing. As Trammell said, business is war, and that way they were able to compete with Apple a bit more. In 1987, there was an interesting news from Atari and Commodore agreement. If you remember, after Trammell was fired from Commodore and then he started the Atari operation, he took over a lot of engineers from Commodore. From another perspective, Commodore helped Amiga to escape from Atari. So they sued each other, but finally in this year, they made an agreement to settle all those at the court. In 1987 February, Commodore introduced the new Amigas. The two models shared a lot of things, but they aimed different markets. There was the cheap one, the 500, which was really a simplified A1000. What do I mean simplified? Let's say that way there was nothing new. The functionality and the features really matched the older machine. The CPU, its speed, of course the memory was increased to 256 to 512 kilobytes, but I think that was the biggest development. To make it cheap, they simplified the chipset and the whole PCB. They integrated the workbench on a ROM on the motherboard, as well as all the stuff under the keyboard. The other machine, the A2000, was the high-end model. It had two variants, the A and B variants, but I will talk about just the B one. The A was developed in Germany, but it was quickly phased out. The B model shared the chipset with the A500. It made it cheaper to produce, but it was possible to expand it in an easy way. For example, it had an expansion slot for the CPU, there was an expansion slot for the GPU or the interlacer, and there were additional slots, Zorro slots and ISO slots. The Zorro 2 is a plug-and-play bus system for the Amiga. There were several cards for these slots, for example hard drive controllers, memory expansions, or bridge boards. Those bridge boards were the IBM PC cards, and they were able to use the ISO slots as well. At that point, everything seemed fine for Commodore. The two new models were really promising. With Rattigan reforms, they also changed from losing money to earn, but something happened. And behind this something happened, it was again Irving Gaud. He fired Rattigan. I do not see a reason behind. There was no sense to fire someone who changed the track from losing to winning. But as I heard, Irving Gaud was really jealous of the success of Rattigan, and this is why he had to go. Apple also introduced at the beginning of the year, so in March, the new machine, the Macintosh II. It was a big step forward, but it was against the idea behind the Macintosh. Steve Jobs' vision was that to produce something like an appliance. So a box where you can connect the keyboard and mouse and it is ready to use. No expansion cards, no CPU upgrades, nothing, just a simple box. If you take a look at the Macintosh II, it looks like an IBM PC. It has a box, it has a separated monitor, keyboard, mouse, and it is possible to expand. If we check the technical specification of the computer, it was really a big step forward. First of all, it was able to handle colors, and not just colors, but pretty high resolution. If it had enough video memory, it was able to produce a picture of 640 by 480 with 256 colors at the same time. I may say that it was the best at this point, even it led behind Amiga. Of course, it had some drawbacks because the CPU had to move all the bits, so it was not possible to produce such smooth animation like the Amiga was able to produce, but still it was a big step forward. Also, the machine was able to produce stereo sound, which was very close to the Amigas. The biggest drawback was the price. The cheapest model was somewhere around $5,500, plus the monitor and maybe some further expansions. If you compare this price to an Atari ST system, from the price of one Macintosh II, it was possible to buy 6 to 8 complete Atari ST systems. What Apple made right in the past, they really forced the developers to use APIs. That way, if they introduced a new machine or new resolution, new system version, until the API was there and it was compatible, it was possible to run the older programs on the new system. In April, IBM also released the result of their development, which was called Personal System 2. They put a lot of effort into this system, and IBM had a tricky plan. On technical side, it was really good. They introduced a lot of things we used for decades. There was the VGA, the new 3.5-inch floppy drive with a higher capacity, also the 72-pin SIMs, so the new memories. But the biggest advancement, the microchannel architecture, failed. It failed not because of technical, but because of business reasons. The original IBM PC series was an open system. It was very well documented, and almost anybody was able to produce a clone. That time it was not possible to patent each and every bits and bolts, and IBM focused on the new plug-and-play bus and patented several parts of it. Their idea was to control the clone makers through those licenses related to microchannel. But what happened on the clone side? Well, they just stayed with the original Isobus, and almost nobody used the MCA. Here I would like to mention few hardware which was not introduced by the IBM, but later on will be important. There was the new Covox and AdLib. The Covox was not really advanced. It was just a digital analog converter connected to the printer port, and it was able to produce some kind of sound, but it was a big step forward compared to the original PC speaker. The other one, the AdLib, was an FM synthesizer, and it was able to produce quite good music. Later on, it became a kind of de facto standard for the IBM PCs because the later released Sound Blaster were compatible with this one. On software side, Microsoft released Windows 2.0. It was far from the point where we can say it was a very useful thingy, but still, it showed the dedication of Microsoft towards releasing a graphical interface for MS-DOS. After the busy year, 1988 was quite calm. Of course, there were new models and news, so let's check them out. After the release of A500, Atari started to lose market in Europe. There were a lot of software studios developing games and other softwares for Atari, but in 88 they started to prefer the Amiga. Why not earlier? It is very simple. The new 500 was much closer to the Atari ST line, and the extra price was justified by the additional features. The Atari community also had a problem. That time modems started to be common, and there were several BBS where they just distributed pirated cracked softwares. Based on interviews, a software written for different platforms produced much higher sales. For example, for Amiga or Macintosh, they produced 4 or 5 times higher sales than on Atari. It doesn't mean there was no Atari version of the softwares, but after that it was not the primary platform for developers. Commodore worked on expansion cards, and they released CPU cards and other stuff for the A2000. Based on those, they released the, let's say, new model. I tend to say that it was not a new model, but an A2000 heavily expanded. So they released the A2500. It had either an A2620 or an A2630 expansion card. The first one had a 68020 CPU running on 14 MHz. The second used a 68030 running on 25 MHz. So both of them were much faster than the base model. Also, there was a new release of the Amiga OS, the 1.3. I dare to say this is the best classic Amiga OS. Most of the Amiga 500s were shipped with this version. Apple also introduced small things. Their biggest development was the System 6. I really like this version because it is very stable. It is able to run a lot of software, and it can run fast on Macintosh classic systems. The biggest development of the Macintosh II line was the 2FX. So this new model sported a new CPU. It had a 68030 running on 16 MHz. If we are talking about the IBM compatible platforms, the biggest news was the rebellion. 9 leading clone makers made an alliance to develop a new bus system. The result was the EISA bus, which was similar to MCA. It never became very popular, but the foundation of the Gang of 9 made it visible how IBM lost the control over this platform. With this news, I'm reaching the end of the period, and I would like to conclude it. At the beginning, Atari started very well, but as we are reaching 88, they were not able to renew and release new and new models. Commodore started the period with financial issues. Rattigan took care of it, but after the successful release of A500 and 2000, Irving Gaud fired him and took over his position. After this power struggle, the development speed of Amigas also slowed down. Apple in 85 lost a lot of engineers and 2 very important persons, but they were able to recover from that, and they released the new Macintosh II line. It was in one hand very advanced, in the other hand it was very pricey. On IBM compatible line, there was a change in 86. It was the year then Compaq took over the leading position of IBM PC compatible development. In 87, IBM released the PS2 line, and they tried to take back the control, but they failed. Each platform had pros and cons. The IBM PCs had a strange position. The XT clones were very cheap, but their features were outdated. On the other hand, there was the high-end IBM PCs with 386 CPUs. Their prices were very high, but they were really capable and able to compete with Macintosh IIs or Amigas. Atari and Amiga had their own niche markets. Atari had MIDI port, so it was possible to connect keyboards as well as multiple synthesizers. A lot of people use them to produce music. I prepared an example for you. Let's listen it. If you know what was that, just drop into the comments. While Atari specialized itself on musicians, Amiga specialized on videos. I mentioned several times it was able to produce fluid animations. Additionally, it was possible to synchronize the video output of the Amiga with another signal. With the green box, that way it was possible to produce a background effect for a video. But both Atari and Amiga was very strong in games. So let's check out few games. With this, I'm reaching the end of this video. I think they speak for themselves. Stay for a few minutes for the games and join me the next time. Goodbye.